Development of the heart tube and clinical embryology. I am Dr. Sarita, Professor of Anatomy. Good morning. We'll be discussing the anatomy and development of the heart tube. Cardiovascular system is the first system to function in the embryo, and heart is the first organ to start functioning. Development of the cardiovascular system is basically from the mesoderm, the second germ cell layer. Heart develops from the mesoderm with a significant contribution by neural crest cells, which is responsible for the septation of the heart. The stages of cardiac development. The cardiac crescent. Then the formation of linear tube. Cardiac looping. Chamber formation, and finally septation of the heart tube. The linear heart tube consists of three layers of cells: inner endocardium, which is endothelium; middle myocardium, the cardiac muscle cell; the outer epicardium, the visceral layer of serous pericardium. The two heart tubes formation and fusion occurs by the third to fourth week. Heart tube forms a loop that's initially a U-shaped, later followed by S-shaped curve, which occurs around the fourth week of intrauterine life. Formation and separation of two atria and ventricles start around the 5th to 8th week, and it is completed by the 8th to 10th week, that is intra-atrial septum and intraventricular septum. The development of the heart tube is the second germ cell layer, the mesoderm. Cardiogenic area on the plate or plate is derived from the splanchnopleuric mesoderm, that is around the 16th day of intrauterine life. The cardiogenic field is at the cranial end. It's derived from the angiogenic cell clusters, and it is seen in the embryonic trilaminar disc rostral to the buccopharyngeal membrane and the neural tube. These cells are derived from the primitive strip. Superior view of the cardiogenic area of a trilaminar embryonic disc. Cardiogenic area appears around the 16th day of intrauterine life. It is derived from the primitive streak, which appears as early as 15th day of intrauterine life. It is caudal to the septum transversum, which is also derived from the intraembryonic mesoderm. Rostral to the procaudal plate or buccopharyngeal membrane, which appears around the 14th day of intrauterine life. At the same time of 16th day, also we have the appearance of the cloacal membrane. The development of the heart tube starts as early as the 16th to 18th day of intrauterine life. Initially, the cardiogenic region, which is derived from the primitive streak, they form cells, then followed by islands. These islands finally form cords and they get canalized. The canalized and they form horseshoe-shaped two endocardial heart tubes. The cardiogenic field is established just after the gastrulation, which appears as early as the 16th day. The horseshoe-shaped cardiogenic field presents a right endocardial tube and a left endocardial tube. Caudally, it's connected to the dorsal or primitive atria, the right and the left dorsal aorta. A cross section at this level, you can see the right and left endocardial heart tubes. Longitudinal section, the cardiogenic field appears on the most cranial part of the trilaminar embryonic disc. Dorsal view or superior view showing the area of the formation of endocardial heart tube. Caudally connected to right and left dorsal aorta. Lateral view showing the cardiogenic area, the endocardial heart tubes, rostral to the neural tube and the oropharyngeal membrane, and ventral to the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity is dorsal to the heart tube before the head fold or the cranial fold. The first cells to migrate from the primitive state form the primary heart field. They form the cranial segments of the heart tube, that is the atria and the ventricles. Ventricles, they are mainly the inflow tracts. Next to migrate forms the secondary heart field, which forms the caudal segments of the heart tube, the outflow tracts, conus caudus and truncus arteriosus. Retinoic acid determines the craniocaudal axis of the primordial heart tube. The primary heart tube initially appears as a cardiac crescentic structure, secondary heart field which appears later. The primary heart field appears around 16 to 18th day, which forms the right atrium, left ventricle and right ventricle, the inflow tracts. The secondary heart field presents the venous pole and the arterial pole, which appears between 20th to 22nd day. The arterial fold forms the right and left ventricles outflow tracts, ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Secondary heart field, the venous pole forms the sinus venosus. Cephalocaudal folding occurs along with the development of the neck, which occurs around the 22nd to 24th day. The heart primordium, which is present at the cranial part of the trilaminar embryonic disc, now is pulled caudally and ventrally. Initially, the heart primordium moves to the cervical region. Later, it moves to the thoracic region. Later, according to the cephalocaudal folds, we have simultaneously lateral folds appearing in the embryonic disc. These lateral folds also appear around 22nd to 24th day. The paired cardiac primordium merges and fuses except in the caudal part. It forms a paired cardiac primordium, forms a single unpaired endocardial heart tube. So to start with, the formation of single heart tube, initially it's a horseshoe-shaped cardiac primordium, later fusion of two endocardial heart tubes which occurs with the lateral folds, which occurs around 22nd to 24th day. At the same time, there is a ventral migration of endocardial heart tubes to the cephalocaudal folds. Coming to the important stages of the development of the heart tube. So by 18th to 22nd day, the two horseshoe-shaped endocardial heart tubes change into a pair of endocardial tubes, and this pair of endocardial heart tubes are connected caudally with the right and left primitive aorta. Later on, the pericardial cavity develops dorsal to the heart tube. With the cephalocaudal and lateral folds, the two endocardial heart tubes move from the cervical region to the thoracic region, and it lies the ventral to the foregut and dorsal to the pericardial cavity. The cephalocaudal folds, due to the cephalocaudal folds and the lateral fold, the cephalic and the caudal ends remain separate. The cephalic end is the arterial end and the caudal end is represented as a venous end. Each presents two horns. The blood from the cephalic horn enters the dorsal aorta. Blood reaches the heart tube via 6 veins or 3 pairs of veins from the caudal end. Initially, as we saw, due to the cranial fold, initially the heart tube lies ventral to the pericardial cavity and caudal to the septum transversum. With the cranial folds and lateral folds, the heart tube comes to lie dorsal to the pericardial cavity. That is the rotation of the heart tube. The fused heart tube enters the dorsal wall of pericardial heart tube. At the same time, we have septum transversum, which is present most cranial to the primitive heart tube, also rotates along with the heart tube. Initially cranially, then comes ventral to the pericardial cavity and finally reaches caudal to the heart tube, fused heart tube. Septum transversum later forms the diaphragm. Fusion of the heart tube is followed by the fusion of the pericardial cavity. So heart islands positioned on the 16th day of intrauterine life, which is derived from the primitive streak. Heart tube repositioned around 22nd to 24th day, where it reaches the thoracic region. Reposition of the cardiogenic field due to the cranial fold, the pericardial cavity and the heart tube both undergo 180 degrees rotation. Fusion of the cardiac primordia presents craniocaudally, conus truncus outflow, primitive ventricles or future ventricles, future atria and the sinus venosus, which is embedded in the septum transversum, that is the diaphragmatic primordia. Cardiac primordia, which develops at the cranial end around 16th day. Cardiac primordia consists of two endocardial heart tubes on the 18th to 28th day. Fusion of the two endocardial heart tubes is around 22nd to 24th day and heart beats as early as 24th day. Migration ventrally from the cranial region to the cervical and finally to the thoracic region, which also occurs around 22nd to 24th day. The single heart tube, which receives venous blood at the caudal pole by three pairs of veins. It begins to pump blood to the dorsal aorta at the cranial pole via the first pair of aortic arch. Formation of the wall of the heart tube also occurs around 22nd to 24th day. The endocardial heart tube is surrounded by mesenchymal cells which form the myoepicardial mantle, which separates the heart tube from the pericardial cavity. The wall of paired cardiac primordia of the heart, that is, they form the inner endocardium. The fused heart tube enters through the dorsal wall of the pericardial cavity into the pericardial cavity. Myoepicardial mantle, which surrounds the heart tube, forms the myocardium and the visceral layer of serous pericardium. The somatopleuric layer of the pericardial cavity forms the parietal layer of serous pericardium. The septum transversum forms the fibrous pericardium. The endocardial heart tube is surrounded by the myocardium by 22nd to 24th day. The heart tube enters the pericardial cavity from the dorsal aspect, continues to elongate in the pericardial cavity and develops series of expansions or dilatation. 5 important dilatations of the heart tube: caudocranially, sinus venosus, primitive atrium, primitive ventricle, bulbus cordus and truncus arteriosus. Sinus venosus with right and left horn forms the venous end of the heart tube. Truncus arteriosus is the arterial end. It is now known as ventral aorta or aortic sac with right and left horns. The bulbus cordus presents 3 regions. The proximal part is bulbus cordus proper. The middle part is known as the conus cordus and the distal part is known as the truncus arteriosus. Bulbus cordus is continuous with primitive ventricle with primitive atria, and primitive atria is continuous with sinus venosus presenting right and left horns. Sinus venosus opens into the primitive atrial chamber via the sinoatrial orifice. Primitive atrial opens into the primitive ventricle via the atrioventricular orifice. Primitive ventricle opens into the bulbus cordus proper via the intraventricular foramen. Each horn of sinus venosus receives 3 pairs of veins: the vitelline veins from the yolk sac, umbilical veins from the placenta which carries oxygenated blood, common cardinal veins or duct of Cure drains the body wall. Vitelline veins and umbilical veins traverse the septum transversum. In fact, sinus venosus with its right and left ward plunges into the septum transversum. The various derives from the different saculations or dilatations of the heart. Bulbus cordus proper, the proximal 1/3, forms the Primitive right ventricle, the trabeculated part. Middle one-third, which forms a conus cauda, forms the outflow tracts of right ventricle, that is infundibulum, aortic vestibule, that is of the left ventricle. Distal one-third, the truncus arteriosus, forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Primitive ventricle forms the trabeculated part of the left ventricle. Primitive atria is partitioned and it forms the roughened part of right and left atrium. Sinus venosus, the body of the sinus venosus and the right horn of sinus venosus is absorbed into the right atrium and it forms the smooth part of right atrium. Left horn almost regresses, only a part of it remains as a remnant and it forms the coronary sinus, which finally drains the venous system of the heart. So coming to the segmentation of the heart and its derivations, once again, the sinus venosus forms the posterior smooth part of the right atrium. Primitive atrium or common atrial chamber forms the roughened part of right atrium and left atrium. Primitive ventricular chamber or common ventricular chamber forms the trabeculated part of the left ventricle. Bulbus cauda forms the trabeculated inflow tract of right ventricle. Conus cauda forms the outflow tracts of left ventricle and right ventricle. Left ventricle, it forms the aortic vestibule. Right ventricle, it forms the infundibulum. Truncus arteriosus forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Coming to the formation of cardiac glue, which occurs around the 24th to 28th day of intrauterine life. So heart primordia, it migrates to the thoracic region, which is followed by the fusion of two endocardial heart tubes, which is completed by 22nd to 24th day. The cranial end represents the arterial end or the arterial outflow. The caudal end represents the venous return or the venous inflow tract. Bulbus cauda and primitive ventricle is in the pericardial cavity, whereas the primitive atrium and sinus venosus remains outside the pericardial cavity to start with, and they are within the septum transversum. By 24th day, it is too long to be accommodated. Heart tube is too long to be accommodated in the pericardial cavity. Thus, it bends and it forms a cardiac loop. So, cardiac folding or loop. How do you get from this to this? The heart tube folds on itself and twists within the pericardial cavity, which is known as cardiac looping. Looping sets up the relationship between the inflow tracts, that is atria, and the outflow tracts, that is ventricles. Folding and rotation of the heart tube, ventricles move ventrally, caudally, and to the right. Atria moves dorsally, cranially, and to the left. The heart tube is suspended within the pericardial cavity by the blood vessels at the cranial and caudal end. Endothelial heart tube is connected dorsally by the dorsal mesocardium. Cranial end of the heart tube is the aortic sac or ventral aorta. It bifurcates into two branches, right and left horns. Similarly, the caudal end, the sinus venosus, also presents right and left horns. The caudal end of the heart tube is the venous end of the heart tube, which is embedded in the septum transversum, that is future diaphragm. The two horns of aortic sac is now connected bilaterally to the dorsal aorta by 6 pairs of aortic arch artery. Fifth is rudimentary and completely disappears. Each horn of sinus venosus also receives 3 pairs of veins, vitelline veins most medially, the vitelline veins from the yolk sac, umbilical veins, that is carrying oxygenated blood from the placenta, common cardinal veins or the duct of Cure, they drain the blood from the body wall of the embryo. The heart tube continues to elongate as the cells are added from secondary heart field to the cranial end. Secondary heart field is regulated by neural crest cells that migrate from the hindbrain, which is responsible for septating the heart tube. The lengthening process is therefore essential in formation of the outflow tracts the conus caudus and the truncus arteriosus, which results in the cardiac looping. Conus caudus forms the outflow tracts of ventricles, whereas the truncus arteriosus forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. The primitive heart tube elongates within the pericardial cavity. Bulbus caudus and the ventricles grow more rapidly within the pericardial cavity than the atrium and sinus venosus, which are outside the pericardial cavity. Cephalic portion of the tube, that is ventricles, bend ventrally, caudally and to the right. Caudal portion, that is the atria, shifts dorsally, cranially and to the left. With the result, the heart tube bends ventrally into the pericardial cavity by the end of starts from 24th day and completed by 28th day. Initially a U bend, later followed by S bend. Cardiac looping is completed by 28th day. Looping becomes the first visual sign of left to right asymmetry of the body. Coming to the clinical correlation, the key aspect of heart tube is right to left orientation along with craniocaudal axis, which is established as early as the early part of the development. Failure to establish the sideness leads to the laterality defects. It may be dextrocardia, right-sided heart, ventricular and septal defect, outflow tract defects, which leads to the aorta and pulmonary defects. The cephalic limb of the loop is occupied by bulbus caudus and truncus arteriosus. The caudal limb of the loop is represented by the primitive atria and sinus venosus. Primitive ventricle lies at the summit or the apex of the loop. By 24th day, the gestation, the straight heart tube elongates, bends, forming the cardiac loop. This rotational motion folding occurs and brings about the future ventricles side by side. Formation of cardiac loop. Normal day looping, which is related to the ventricles. So day loop, the right ventricle, which is derived from the bulbus caudus, lies to the right side of left ventricle, which is derived from primitive ventricular chamber. In L looping, the right ventricle, which is derived from the bulbus caudus, lies to the left side of left ventricle, which is derived from primitive ventricular chamber. So D looping, normal cardiac looping. Pulmonary trunk arises from the right ventricle anteriorly and aorta arises from the left ventricle posteriorly. In L looping or ventricular inversion, it's a defect, so wherein the left ventricle is on the right and is connected to the right atrium via the mitral valve, and right ventricle is on the left, is connected to the left atrium via the tricuspid valve. Aorta arises anteriorly from the right ventricle and pulmonary trunk arises posteriorly from left ventricle. This defect is called as L transfusion of great vessels. So we have D looping, normally related ventricles, L looping, inverted related ventricles. L looping, the transposition of great vessels, is a rare form of congenital heart disease. It's usually unknown cause. This double reversal allows the body to receive rich oxygen blood and lungs still receive oxygen poor blood. Right atria is connected to aorta and left ventricle is connected, right ventricle is connected to aorta and left ventricle is connected to pulmonary trunk. Some people with this condition never need treatment. Others develop symptoms and need treatment. In left, transposition of great ventricles, where ventricles are switched off, or ventricle inversion, the right ventricle must do work of left ventricle. This puts a lot of extra work on the right ventricle. Over a time can lead to heart failure. In de-looping transposition of great vessels, the aorta arises from the right ventricle anteriorly and pulmonary trunk arises from left ventricle posteriorly. Leads to cyanotic heart disease, and this is mainly due to the non-twisting of aorticopulmonary septum. Requires surgery within the first week of life. So what actually we conclude as, after the formation of the heart tube, which completes at the end of 24th day, the important step is development of heart looping. So D-looping is normal, L-looping is inversion of ventricles. The position of ventricles in relation to atria is determined by the looping. Heart tube may loop to the right, forming a D loop, which is normal, or loop to the left, that is L loop, which is abnormal. If D bulboventricular loop fails to migrate to the left hemithorax, the heart is on the right side, forming the dextrocardia. Dextrocardia with situs inversus. So dextrocardia, the cardiac position, that is a mirror image of normal anatomy. The heart is on the right side of the thoracic cavity instead of left side, which is mainly due to the result of defect in lateralization. Variable position of apex of the heart. Levocardia, the heart is on the left side of the chest, apex pointing leftward. It's a normal position. Mesocardia, heart in the midline, apex pointing inferiorly. Dextrocardia, heart is on the right side of the chest, apex pointing rightward. Ectopic cardia's heart is partially or completely outside the chest wall. Initially, the right atrium and sinus venosus are outside the pericardial cavity. Later, with the looping, they enter the pericardial cavity. And future bulbocardius and primitive ventricle, which forms future ventricles, lie side by side. Primitive atrium, initially two, fuses as it and becomes a single primitive atrial chamber as it enters the pericardial heart tube and comes to lie dorsal to the truncus arteriosus. Sinus venosus is dorsal to the primitive atrium and is also shifted from the septum transversum and remains as a double structure with right and left horns. The primitive atria dorsal to the truncus arteriosus. Sinus venosus is no longer visible because it lies dorsal to the primitive atrial chamber. Sinus venosus communicates with the primitive atrial chamber via the sinoatrial orifice ventrally. Externally, atrioventricular junction. Internally, it represents as common atrioventricular canal. Junction between the primitive ventricle and bulbus cordis externally. Internally, it represents primary or primitive intraventricular foramen. Before septation, that is 4th week, the blood flow is from the venous end and it reaches through the arterial end. Circulation of primordial heart after the cardiac looping before the septation, that is before the 20th day. Blood enters through the sinus venosus by the 3 pairs of veins. It enters the primitive atrium via the sinoatrial orifice. Blood from the primitive atrial enters the primitive ventricle via the common atrioventricular canal. Blood from the primitive ventricle enters the bulbus cordis through the primitive intraventricular foramen. Blood from the bulbus cordis enters the conus cordis and later the truncus arteriosus. And from truncus artery it reaches the dorsal aorta via the aortic arch arteries. Primitive atrium, the blood from it enters the primitive ventricle via common atrioventricular canal. From the primitive ventricle reaches the bulbus cordis through primitive intraventricular foramen, bulbus cordis to conus cordis, and finally truncus arteriosus. The blood from the ventral aorta enters the dorsal aorta by 6 pairs of aortic arch artery. Congenital heart defects are the problems in the structure of the heart. It's usually investigated by pulse oximeter, a physical examination, certain heart tests, genetic testing, abnormalities in the cardiac looping, dextrocardia, and dextrocardia with situs inversus, genes regulating the sinus effect during the gastrulation. Dextrocardia, entire heart is on the right side instead of the left. Situs inversus is a complete reversal of asymmetrical organ. Heart on the right side and other asymmetrical organs are reversed. Levocardia, normal. Dextrocardia, heart on the right side. Dextrocardia with situs inverse, heart on the right side, showing the stomach bubble also on the right side. In fact, all the abdominal organs are opposite. Mesocardia, apex inferiorly. Ectopic cardia, heart exposed due to the sternal defect. And this is mainly due to the faulty apposition of lateral folds of the embryo to close the ventral wall. Babies die within few hours after the birth. Coming to the summary of the heart tube. Cardiac crescent is formed on the 16th day. Linear heart tube is formed, that is fusion, by 20th to 24th day. Cardiac looping occurs between 24th to 28th day, and matured heart is finally formed between the end of the 10 weeks or the 50th day. Two heart tubes, formation, fusion, migration by 24th day. Folding or cardiac looping, U and S curve by 24th to 28th day. Cardiac looping is important for inflow and outflow tracts. Final stage of separation of chambers between starts around 5th to 8th week and completed by the 10th week. A definitive heart tube, the primordial heart tube or cardiac plate 16th day, two endocardial heart tubes 18th day, descent ventrally to the thoracic region by 24th day, that is due to the cranial folds. Fusion of heart tubes, that is due to the lateral folds, which occurs also by 24th day. Cardiac looping by 24th to 28th day, and wall of the heart tube is also formed between 24th to 28th day. Endocardium is derived from the endothelial heart tube. Myocardium is derived from the myoepicardial mantle. Epicardium, the visceral layer of serous pericardium, is also derived from myoepicardial mantle. Parietal layer of serous pericardium is derived from somatopleuric layer of pericardial cavity. Fibrous pericardium is derived from septum transversum. So coming to the adult derivatives of various subdivisions of the heart tube, sinus venosus forms coronary sinus and smooth part of right atrium. Primitive atrial chamber forms the auricle and the roughened part of right and left atrium. Proximal part of bulbus cordus and primitive ventricle forms the roughened or the tabaculated inflow tracts of the ventricle. Conus cordus forms the aortic vestibule and infundibulum, the outflow tracts of the ventricles. Truncus arteriosus forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Video showing the formation of heart tube and the migration. Formation of cardiac loop. The schematic diagram showing the heart tube ventral to the foregut, and foregut is ventral to the neural tube. Thank you.